nonprofit voluntary sector here at Alberta Council. If you have seen one of my webinars before, you generally know that there's a lot of information to go through and I tend to speak really quickly, so I apologize in advance. I've tried to shift it a little bit this year to make the information a little more digestible and a little less overwhelming. So in the agenda today, we will go through the general context. I've kind of clumped the sectors together so we have overarching groupings rather than a 15 or 20 ministry deep dive. And then we'll look at some kind of projections and trends that we see moving forward. So got lots of information to go through, short period of time, lots of time for questions at the end. So feel free to pop them in the Q&A box and I will get to them as often as I can. And anything I miss, I'll answer following the webinar. So general budget overview, my colleague Zach did a deep dive on a lot of the fiscal outlook stuff on Friday. So I'm just going to keep this high level to help frame the context of what we're operating in. The short version is the deficit persists across the plan horizon and the operating environment is framed as restrained and targeted. The government is saying that population growth is putting pressure on core services, oil prices are weaker, and there's global trade instability. So instead of big spending cuts or broad tax increases, they're protecting core services and carrying the fiscal impacts through deficits. So in this budget, GOA has invested $1.9 billion in new funding across the healthcare system and about $722 million in new education funding to address growth, teacher compensation, and infrastructure pressures. So what this means for nonprofits is not that nothing isn't happening. It's generally kind of a boring budget, frankly, compared to last year, but just means that decisions are getting justified differently. There's more emphasis on outcomes, more emphasis on value, on whether service reduces downstream pressure in health, justice, shelter systems, or child intervention, that kind of thing. And so this sets the environment for every ministry and every contract that you wind up entering into. It's a multi-year deficit plan, so it's constrained spending, decisions are targeted. We've had these, for those of you familiar, we've had these conversations for a while. Next year is election year, so we'll see a different conversation. But for this year, a lot of the questions are going from the GOA are going to be less so is this a good idea and more what outcomes does this deliver and what does it cost and what does it prevent elsewhere. Debt and deficit, debt to GDP has steadily increased over the last couple of years, rising from 7.2% in 2024-25 to a forecasted 8.3% in 25-26 and 10.5% in 26-27. One structural pressure point is the debt servicing cost that is projected to rise across the horizon, and that competes with program dollars over time. So this reduces flexibility and limits the system, which results in more pressure on performance language, tighter reporting, and targeted investment choices. There is a steady theme in this budget about program review and efficiency, and I know we saw some of this in 25-26, but it is a double down in this budget. You're going to see, and we saw this in the Treasury Board and Finance mandate letter back in October, I think it was, that they were tasked to do a program review across all government. There was some confusion as to whether or not that was just grant programming, but from our understanding, this is a full-fledged review of every program. My understanding is that this is going to happen ad hoc, ministry by ministry. They have not been given a percentage and said, hey, cut 10% for your budget. They're just making sure that programs align with government direction, policy direction, and that funding is being used effectively and efficiently. So the practical takeaway here is you'll see a lot more questions of what's working, what does it cost per client, what's the measurable result. You're going to probably see some more standardization in reporting and tighter outcome measurement. And tighter expectations in contracts and grants. And some of you have already started to see this. Workforce pressure. So, as you may be aware, there was a ton of public sector contract negotiations this past fiscal year. This budget speaks a lot to what those pressures have cost for the budget. The practical operating issue that cuts across every sector here is obviously workforce. A lot of you are struggling with workforce challenges as well. But when public sector wages and staffing pressures, obviously you folks feel it the most, especially in the human services, housing, disability supports, all that fun stuff. So when that budget line goes up and the workforce capacity isn't there, delivery bottlenecks happen, and that usually lands on the community providers. There's also the contract competition, right? And many of you find yourself competing with wages of government. And so this will be a continuous pressure point moving forward. I'm not going to do a deep dive in healthcare because this could take all day. So I'm going to use this as an overlay to just kind of give you a bit of context. So obviously there's a ton of system shifting happening right now still. The system realignment efforts continue. This is going to affect contracts. It's going to affect downstream service provision, et cetera, et cetera. There is more funding going into healthcare, but it's targeted funding. So notably in hospital and surgical services, the drugs and supplemental health benefit budget line actually received a cut of about $38 million. Support services also received a cut of more than $150 million. Population and public health received a cut of about $34 million from the 86 budgeted, but it's about $42 million increase from what they have forecasted to have spent. So there's a bit of a nuance there. In primary and preventative health, population and public health also received a budget cut of almost $100 million from the forecast spend and over $400 million from the 2025-26 budgeted amount. And then the other health system services and support budget line also saw about $400 million cut from the forecast spend and a $900 million cut from the budgeted spend. So while we are seeing increases in a lot of the capital type programming, as you will see in the image there on the screen, a lot of the frontline public type ad hoc programming, preventative programming, that kind of stuff, we'll see probably a reduction in service provision capacity with some of these cuts. So this obviously results in downflow pressures for some of the folks on the periphery helping serve the same population. And so this is just something to be aware of as we move forward in the system. The core human services and system capacity, this includes a lot of our social services and human services sectors. This is the biggest cluster for a lot of our nonprofit operators. It's where most of the day-to-day operating exposure sits as well with this budget. So we'll break this down by ALSS. ALSS is obviously a massive ministry, so we're going to further break that one down into housing and homelessness, seniors and continuing care, disability supports, education and childcare, mental health and addiction, public safety, advanced ed, JETI, CFS, Indigenous relations, and then community and visitors. So we'll go through this step by step. Assisted living and social services replaces last year's seniors, community and social services ministry. Because this ministry is gigantic, we've broken it down into subsector to make it more digestible. So we'll go into seniors support and homelessness and disability supports right after this. But that said, overall, the ALSS ministry's net operating expenses are about $11.6 billion, which is an increase of approximately $760 million from the 2025-2026 forecast. The ministry's capital budget is approximately $65.5 million, which is an increase of about $7 million from 2025-2026 forecast. A lot of the budget increase in this ministry is targeted towards the health side of things. So funding for assisted living Alberta increased by approximately $250 million from the forecasted spend to about $5.25 billion. Funding for FCSS remains unchanged at $105 million. I know this comes as a disappointment to a lot of us who have been advocating for an increase because it's been pretty stagnant funding for the last several years. And then continuing care also received an increase of about $245 million to bring that funding pot to $626 million. Housing and homelessness numbers specifically. So the Alberta Social Housing Corporation funding is decreased by approximately $29.5 million, bringing funding to about $648 million for affordable housing. This includes building, renewing, maintaining, and operating government-supported housing and programs. There's $217.5 million that's been allocated to homeless shelters, navigation and support centers, and then housing supports. The AHPP program, so that's the Alberta, the Affordable Housing Partnership Program, our primary capital fund for new housing builds, affordable housing builds, is allocated approximately $204 million, which is an increase from the forecasted $182 million in 2025-2026. This budget line will continue to increase over the next 3 years. Meanwhile, the IHCP program, the Indigenous Housing Capital Program, actually receives a budget cut, dropping from $42 million to $25 million, and it'll remain at $25 million for the next 3 years. Homelessness and housing support services will also see a reduction of about $13 million from the forecasted spend, but this is an increase of about $6 million from the budgeted. Lots and lots happening in seniors and continuing care right now. $586.6 million has been allocated for seniors financial assistance programs. Assisted Living Alberta is at about $5.3 billion, and then the continuing care capital is at $344 million. However, there are significant program changes also happening in this program. So Finance Minister Nate Horner said that the province is dropping the threshold for eligibility by 9% for seniors programming to align with other Canadian provinces. Under the new rules, an individual will only be eligible if they receive an income of less than $32,690 a year, which is down from a cutoff of $34,770. For a couple, the cutoff will be $53,800, down from $56,820. Provincial officials say the grant component of the seniors' home adaptation and repair program threshold will be similarly capped. And then another change that will affect seniors is the Alberta Caregivers Tax Credit. So the provincial government plans to consolidate 2 tax credits into one, and then we'll change the eligibility criteria. The new tax credit will focus on Albertans caring for loved ones with physical and mental health impairment. It will exclude anyone caring for someone who is aging but not infirm. Provincial officials say about, Here we go. Provincial officials say 35,000 people are currently getting this tax credit, which is worth roughly $1,000 as a non-refundable credit. Next year, they're estimating about 16,500 Albertans will lose this credit. So whatever your view of this policy, it's operationally relevant because it can shift demand onto community navigation, basic needs supports, and housing stability services, especially for seniors near the threshold. So a lot of people might see additional capacity challenges and increase in service demand as folks try to navigate these system changes. Disability support, I am sure there are a lot of questions around this, and I still don't have all the answers, unfortunately, but disability income assistance is up to $1.698 billion, which is an increase of $36 million. Disability services is up $89 million to $1.751 billion. Employment and income support is up $43 million. Income support, however, programs now will have a limitation of 6 months, and so there will be room for review, and exceptions can be made, but this is a new program policy that they will be implementing. About $223 million will be trimmed from programs for people with developmental disabilities. So this is your PDD programming. Government officials are saying no person will receive less. It's all about structural reform. I'm not sure what that looks like at this point. We're also looking obviously at the ADAP AISH transition. And so ADAP begins July 1st, 2026. The maximum ADAP benefit is $1,740 per month. There will be a $200 a month transition benefit for people moving from AISH to ADAP through December 31st, 2027 to maintain the maximum total benefit level. Health benefits continue until age 65 for former ADAP clients, regardless of employment income. We don't have the program criteria for ADAP yet. We don't know what that looks like, and we don't know how those decisions are going to be made. We know there are lots of questions around this program, but for now, we just know that it will be effective July 1st. The third watch item in this budget is looking at planning and operations and how all these changes are rolled out. So we've seen a lot of systems change in a very short period of time, and a lot of the downstream effects and fear come from not knowing how this is going to happen. And so we don't know the operationalization, we don't know the service standards, we don't know the appeals and review process, we don't know any of these. And so for you folks who operate in this world on a day-to-day, that poses extra capacity challenges. And so a lot of this is going to be readying yourselves to adjust on the fly as much as possible. Education and childcare. This is one of the protected priority areas in the government. The education budget is increasing by just over $1 billion this year, with increased support for school facilities, program support services, and operations. The capital budget is also increasing this year by approximately $500 million, primarily to support school facilities. There's $10.8 billion in operating expenses allocated to support instruction and early childhood services. Some of this increase is reflected because of the teachers' salary negotiation contract stuff. $4.1 billion over 3 years to support maintenance and planning and construction of new schools. There's increased capital investment in school facilities by approximately $500 million. There's about an $80 million increase to accredited independent schools and early childhood service operators. Decrease in student transportation by $29 million, and then government will continue supporting career education and promotion of high demand careers. Finally, the one thing I need to flag is the childcare budget line. You'll see on there somewhere near the end there. It goes up to $2.1-ish billion, 26-27. There is a steep decline in 2027 and 2028. And this is because the government is currently renegotiating this agreement with the feds, and we don't know what that's going to look like. I suspect we will come to some form of agreement. I don't have a crystal ball, I wish, but it is a watch point that we'll have to keep our eyes on to see where that goes and how that's renegotiated and what impact that'll have on the system overall. Mental health and addictions, one of the most significant operating growth areas in the budget. Operating expenses have increased by about $65 million from budget 2025 estimate. Total expenses increases to about $2 billion, which reflects a $167 million or 8.9% increase from 25-26 third quarter forecast. This increase is primarily due to implementing the Compassionate Intervention Act and Acute Care Action Plan, growth in the Recovery Alberta services, and then the operations of the recovery communities and collective bargaining. Roughly $15 million decrease in expenditure for continuum of care services. There's a $128 million that's been allocated to diagnostic and therapeutic services. $48 million allocated to information technology, which is a $6 million increase from 2025-26. In part, this is because they are looking to shift from their current database system, which the name of which is escaping me at this moment, but they are looking at moving to a new one. There is a $6 million increase to program and facility support. The core recovery operating funding remains unchanged. And then there's a $104 million increase for the community care and treatment services. There will be an increased focus on capacity, navigation, housing stability, post-discharge support. We know that in this session, there will be amendments made to the Compassionate Intervention Act. So those are things we'll have to look for to see how that impacts programs moving forward. But otherwise, this budget remains relatively stable. Public safety and emergency service, even if you don't work directly in it, you all intersect with it and with the government's focus on public safety and social disorder. This one's one to pay attention to. Total expenses for PSES have increased to $1.5 billion, which is an increase of $60 million. Most of this can be attributed to public sector compensation, police support, the Police Review Commission, and funds to combat human trafficking. There is $56.3 million allocated to address organized crime, child pornography, gun violence, drug trafficking, and prolific offenders. $36.9 million to implement the new Alberta Sheriff's Police Service. I was asked to make it very clear that the Alberta Sheriff's Police Service is not meant to replace the RCMP, but they are meant to augment and give municipalities the option to choose if they so desire. There is $14.9 million allocated to sheriff's interdiction patrol teams to strengthen actions against illegal smuggling of drugs, firearms, and people across the Alberta United States border. $28.9 million is allocated to expand First Nations police services to support public safety in Indigenous communities. $5.5 million is allocated to grants and initiatives to combat human trafficking. Victims of crime assistance is at $10.5 million. And then there's an additional $23.1 million allocated to partner organizations who are delivering the services. So these are the on-the-ground victim support system delivered by external organizations. So it's intended to provide stable and consistent victim services across the province. Children and family services. We're making good time. Great. Total expense is estimated at $1.7 billion in 2026-27, which is an increase of $63 million, or about 3.9% from 2025-26. The Alberta Child and Family Benefit is budgeted at $405 million, which is an increase of about $30 million, or 8% from 2025-26, reflecting population growth, the 2% escalator to benefit rates, and then higher phase-out income thresholds. The expense grows by $40 million to $415 million by 2028-2029. Early intervention services have increased by roughly $4 million year over year. Expense allocation for Indigenous partnerships has held steady since the last forecast. In third quarter 2025, roughly $2 million decrease to prevention of family and sexual violence from forecasted spend, but an increase from the budgeted amount. Family resource networks, which I know some of us were looking out for, funding remained unchanged, so it's flat at $67 million. There's $29 million allocated for fund community-based organizations delivering sexual violence and family violence supports, which is an increase of $4 million. So while complexity and capacity pressures continue, workforce stability will be the limiting factor in a big way. I see questions, but if it's okay with all of you, I will answer them at the end. Advanced Ed, I wanted to focus on the workforce angle of this. The Advanced Ed's ministry net total operating expenses are approximately $3 billion, which is a slight decrease of about $166 million from the forecast. There is $7.13 billion allocated to operations. Student aid is increasing marginally to by 16.5 million. Funds allocated for regulated professions is increasing to 1.4 million. And then funding for allocated for apprenticeships increases marginally from 47.3 million in the 2025-26 budget to 48.9 million. There's a targeted $118 million flagged for enrollment expansion, plus $30 million additional to increase seats in high demand occupations. One of the targeted ones was the vet school in Calgary, the U of C. And then we also see a focus on aligning PSC programs to employment and with current and emerging labor market demands. So there's an $18 million allocated to industry partners and nonprofits for initiatives related to development, expansion, and promotion of designated trades careers. I don't know how that funding is being allocated or what programs that's being allocated through, but you can see the government still has a focus on the trades pipeline. There is opportunity here for partnership with those community providers, finding ways to have placements and employer alignment that we can try and wedge yourselves into to try and help with some of the workforce challenges. JETI now includes immigration, which is new. Last year that was in multiculturalism and immigration. This will receive an estimated 189 million in revenue, significant portion of that coming from labor market agreements. The largest expense in this ministry is for economic development and trade at $134 million, which is actually down from the $175 million that was forecasted in 2025-26. Also remember that childcare used to be in this ministry last year, and so that is a substantial shift in this budget. Immigration, the budget largely stayed on par with last year's total at about $36 million. There is $114 million allocated for workforce strategies, but this will see a steady decrease in funding over the next couple of years. And then there's $94 million for skills and training support. There's $16 million allocated for economic immigration programs, and $15 million in grants supporting workforce integration for newcomer immigration and the practical takeaway here is outcomes and partnerships. You're going to be, I think some of you saw this through the SILP grant too. There's a significant shift in the way we're measuring and integrating our immigration and newcomers or immigrants and newcomers into the province. And so you're going to see a difference in the way that you have to report on your success in your programming. This slide is kind of tourism and sport, arts and culture kind of thrown into one. Arts, culture, status of women, net total operating expenses are approximately $199 million, which is a decrease of about $27 million. Most notably with a reduction in the status of women budget line, which is down 13 million to 6.6 million from the budgeted 19.7 million, but only down 1.3 million from the forecasted spend. And then as well as the community and voluntary support services, which is down $26 million from the forecasted spend and $22 million from the budgeted spend. There's a continued focus on promoting and celebrating Alberta's unique culture and heritage, including through prominent display of the provincial flag and motto, and then enhancing the scope and size of Alberta Day celebrations. The Ministry of Tourism and Sports net total expenses will be about $6 million lower in this budget compared to last year, despite the government's goal of increasing the province's visitor economy by $25 billion. Revenue from premiums, fees, and licenses are expected to increase slightly compared to last year, although it is unclear if that was due to volume or an increase in visitor fees. There's $9 million allocated to the active community initiatives to support the development of small to mid-sized sport and recreation facilities throughout the province. This is a reduction of $1 million compared to last year's budget. There's $75.2 million allocated to Travel Alberta, which is the exact same as what was in 2025. And then An allocation of $2.5 million was included in budget 2025 to support major sports. That seems to have been cut out of this budget year. Indigenous relations, so this ministry largely saw a hold in their budget line. There's $3.9 million allocated to the Indigenous Reconciliation Initiative to support projects that revitalize and enhance cultures, traditions, and languages. There's a desire to develop an MOU with the Carney government for the Pathways Carbon Capture Project and West Coast Pipeline to align consultation processes and create timely and effective engagement with Indigenous communities. The Employment Partnerships Program and the Aboriginal Business Investment Fund, so EPP and ABIF, will annually invest $4 million and $8.3 million respectively in employment training and business development opportunities, but largely unchanged. We wanted to highlight a couple of changes in tone and emphasis shift between budget 25-20 and this year's budget. It gives you an idea of where the government's looking. So budget 2025 leaned heavily on challenge and external pressures, and budget 2025 reads more like implementation and performance, delivery mechanics, and program parameters. There's a lot of focus on, as much as we're worried about the resource royalties, you see through the referendum questions how we're looking at trying to change the way we deliver programming. So to point one, obviously framed as a budget 2025 was framed as a response to external pressures. Broad affordability signals such as targeted tax release, cost containment measures, and focus supports allowed the province to acknowledge household pressure without committing to large structural spending increases. Budget 2026, on the other hand, is being framed around implementation and performance, emphasizing execution over announcement and focusing on how programs are delivered rather than expanding their scope. So this is going to be really, really important for you guys as the government does their program review, is ensuring that you are clear in how you are delivering your programs, what the cost savings are, what the impact is, etc., etc. Clear program parameters, measurable outcomes, tightened delivery mechanics, signal fiscal discipline, and an expectation of results from existing investments. It's all about return on investment. We all know this, but that will be doubled down on during this review process. In theory, by looking at things this way, the funding translates into predictable results-driven service delivery rather than fragmented program growth. There is going to be an increased focus on partnerships, and we hear this repeatedly over and over again. It just feels like another buzzword at this point in time, but continually government, especially for the nonprofit sector, feels like there is a lot of duplication of services. And so we have to look at ways that we can show government how you differentiate and why your services are unique and impactful. Funding conversations are going to tilt towards outcomes and unit costs. So you're going to be looking at things like, what is the measurable impact? What does it cost per client per outcome? What happens if the capacity disappears? If you have weak evidence or unclear objectives, your program's more at risk. Reporting is likely to become more demanding. Even where funding remains stable, the cost to deliver may rise because you're going to be asked to meet more consistent outcome reporting, audit readiness, and compliance expectations, which obviously increases demand and reduces capacity. There is a reallocation risk for programs seen as duplicative or misaligned. So under the review mindset, government often consolidates services, shifts delivery models, or recompetitions contracts, especially where multiple providers serve the same function without clear differentiation. And I've spoken with many folks who are probably on this call. I can't see who's on this call, and we've had this conversation over and over again that there is going to be renewed competition. And so things that seemed safe beforehand may not be safe anymore. Practical impact for you folks: invest in proof and delivery readiness. You need an evidence package, clear service model, outcome metrics, unit costs, drivers, demonstrated demand, and concrete examples of avoided downstream costs. I recognize that this is a very challenging thing to measure. We work with human beings. It is difficult to measure the impact of these things, but wherever possible, you're going to want to have data to back up the work you're doing. Otherwise, that is the presentation in a nutshell. We got through it a lot faster than I thought, so that's great. It gives me time to answer the questions that we see here. One of the questions is, what are the new rules for seniors in continuing care? We don't have all of the new rules for seniors in continuing care. Those will be released in program guidelines that have not been released yet. We just know how the income thresholds have changed. PowerPoint slides will be distributed to everybody after the fact. There's a lot of information in there. Greatest risk to the nonprofit sector, is it downstream effects with additional pressure put on post-treatment service providers, as an example. The greatest risk I think I see for the sector right now is just in this program review, with the continued mentality that there are too many nonprofits in the province and there's too many people doing the same work. You're going to see a potential shift in the way funding, or continued potential shift in how the funding is allocated. And so I think this is probably the biggest risk factor right now. Obviously, as the system continues to realign with current government policy direction, you're going to also see more pressure points as the transition is maybe more abrupt than many of us would like. Grant review. So somebody's asking if we can expect a grant review, any information on the timeline, and if all grants will be reviewed. So to this question, I did address a little bit. It'll be an ad hoc review. There's no timeline. It should be done this fiscal year. It'll be done ministry by ministry. It doesn't sound like there's a formal process. It'll be the administration going through every single one of their programs. So it's not just going to be individual grants. This is going to be program review as well to ensure alignment with government policy. Can you speak more to reiterate what you said about homelessness funding? I will scroll back to that section because I don't have the numbers memorized. There we go. Some of these changes in the numbers here reflect the defunding of the 7 cities. And so we're still waiting on the homelessness panel thing that they established back in December of 2024, I think it was, where they were looking at how they wanted to collect data on how homelessness stats are collected. There is some concern about the point in time count. There was some concern in how the 7 cities were collecting them. Some of you might remember the very public debate in the newspaper between Minister Nixon and MLA Irwin about the stat collection process. And so some of these changes in funding are reflective of those conversations. There's a continued push to implement the I think it's called Stronger Foundations 10-year plan for housing and homelessness, which really is trying to push less government involvement in affordable housing and housing and homelessness supports, and more of the triple P type partnerships. So you'll have more private partners in there partnering with your nonprofits. And so this is where some of this is coming from. If that doesn't answer your question, double down on it and I'll get to it. Recording of the presentation will be available. We'll send it out with the slides. 50% decrease in CFIP funding year over year. Yes, okay. This encompasses the entire CFIP program. Yet the context here is this was an expected cut. So they had a temporary 3-year increase in CFIP to $50 million. to try and address the backlog in infrastructure that we have. They were quite proud of this temporary increase. It was mentioned in all of the estimate committees last year too, but there was no indication that there was any chance that that funding was going to continue. And under this deficit environment, I'm not surprised that they maintained that commitment to reduce it back to the original $25 million. The overall funding change for FCSS, there is no change. It stayed stagnant at $105 million, which is unfortunate. But something that FCSS AA and municipalities, I think RMA and AV munis, both have resolutions to continue to advocate for an increase in that fund. Do you expect legislative changes in the fall session if the government's proposal for limiting services to some categories of immigrants receive strong support in the referendum? Do you expect this to apply only to government-delivered service programs, or is it possible the government will require that contracted service providers verify immigration status before offering services? I suspect there's going to be a ton of ramifications from the referendum. I think October 19th is early enough that they could absolutely introduce legislation around the results of that. I think we're going to see budget ramifications because of the results of that referendum as well. I think if I had to guess for whether or not government will require that contracted service providers verify immigration status before offering. If you're contracted by the government, yeah, I suspect that will be a requirement too. If you're an independent contractor or contracted through the feds or something and not considered a public body, because obviously we have Bill 18, the Provincial Priorities Act, that we also have to take into consideration for funding. I suspect that will all intersect. So I think the fall session and the next winter session could be quite interesting. Egg Society funding. I think if I recall correctly, that was cut a little bit. Let me just look that up super quick. I don't recall offhand, so give me 2 seconds to pull up that number. I might have to look that up and get back to you. So I don't have it off the top of my head. If you shoot me an email, I'll make sure I get you that answer. CIP funding, if I recall correctly, also remained unchanged. That program remained unchanged. Capital funding took the biggest hit. So looking it up, the exact numbers. Yep, CIP remained unchanged. The lens that GOA is looking to reduce the number of nonprofits duplication. Do you think that organizations that have a fundraising arms are better positioned to not get squeezed out? I think that's an individual organization question as to sustainability of services, whether or not your fundraising arm is going to be enough to sustain your operations if GOA funding is lost. I know that the fundraising environment right now is quite challenging. There's constriction across the private sector as well. And so I think you'll see an increase in competition for fundraising dollars as well. And so this is a risk conversation and a organizational review to make sure that you have the sustainability to continue forward. You recap what you said about allocations to career education and supports. Absolutely. To pull up my notes. Okay. So to this question, in terms of career education and supports, you've got an increase in funding to apprenticeships. You've got some of this is in the Jetty one too. Hold on. Advanced did. Do. Here we go. Okay, funding allocated for apprenticeships increases marginally from 47.3 million to 48.9 million. There's $118 million targeted for enrollment expansion and $30 million to increase seats in high demand occupations. So this is healthcare, this is a vet school, this is some of the education things. There's also, again, the continued focus on alignment of programming. So there's $18 million allocated to industry partners and nonprofits for initiatives related to development, expansion, and promotion of designated trades careers. Does that answer your question? Hopefully. Otherwise, I think we've got through all the other questions. Lisa, I'll get back to you about the Egg Society funding. Apologies that I can't find that on the fly here. But if there are no further questions, I will give you back the last remaining bit of your the National School Food Programming. I don't remember seeing that in the budget. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. There's 400 pages of documents and I might have missed it. Let me see if I can find it. It's also federal, and so they might not have specifically labeled it. So just let me. The National School Program. Yeah, there's $25 million allocated to that program with a corresponding increase in federal revenue. And then, Funky, you were talking about education supports in jobs, economy, trade. Can you clarify your question? Happy to try and answer. What was your initial question? Allocations to career education supports. Okay, for this one then, if you think it's this one, we've got $114 million for workforce strategies. Not entirely clear what your question is, sorry. $94 million for skills and training support. There's $16 million for economic immigration programs and $15 million in grants supporting workforce integration. Does that answer your question? Somebody's asking me about the impact on ethnocultural grant program as well as the CIP grant program. Until we see the grant guidelines, I don't know what the impact is going to be. I suspect we're going to continue to see an adjustment in the language in the grant guidelines to align with government policy and program initiatives and priorities. You're going to have to reframe some of your deliverables, especially when it comes to some of the ethnocultural things and immigration programming. For those of you who did the SILP grant this year, who worked with us this year and the previous year, you noticed a complete overhaul in how we had to change the way we drafted those. So I think we're going to continue to see some realignment in those programs. But until we see the grant guidelines, I don't know what that's going to look like. Arts funding. Somebody's asking me about arts funding. That's this one here. Alberta Foundation of the Arts got a $3.5 million increase. There wasn't a lot of changes in arts status, culture of women. That was an incorrect word, but regardless, arts, culture, status of women. The largest reductions were in status of women budget line and then in the community voluntary support services. So the art lines has largely remained unchanged. You will see I put up the capital plan. So this is kind of where the funding is looking at for capital expenditures, where that's all going. Yeah, the cut in PDD funding, I'm still trying to get some information on for more detail. The idea is that they're doing structural changes to the program, but I don't have the new program guidelines, so we don't know how the program restructuring is going to look yet. So it's something we're watching. When I find out, I'm happy to share, but right now I don't have a lot of details on that. The Canada Alberta Productivity Grant. Yeah, that's a good question. Just looking it up. It remains in existence under Jobs, Economy, and Trade. I'm looking up that specific, the CAPG here. It's still listed under Jobs, Economy, and Trade, obviously, but not actually seeing a specific budget allocation to it at this point. So I'm thinking it's lumped into, thinking it might be lumped into workforce strategies, but I will look into that and figure that answer out because I don't see a specific budget allocation that I can see. What is the funding going forward for seniors recreation centers? I have no idea what that looks like. Is that on the screen? On the screen. I don't know is the answer to that question. I don't know what the funding going forward for senior recreation centers is. I know that there is a large revitalization program that they allocated funding to, but I don't know specifically how that relates to the seniors recreation centers unless they're within the lodge programs themselves. The amount for PDD funding cut, I believe, was 223 million, if I recall correctly. Environment and conservation, yeah, I was going to speak to this one briefly. I thought I was going to have time. Those two were really unchanged. So if I look at my notes here, not lightly, it's not a huge focus of this government. Looking at my notes, so give me 3 seconds here. Forestry and parks. The big focus for these ones are implementing a Crown land recreation and conservation strategy and a new plan for parks. You will see a budget increase for forestry and parks in, forest budget line remains unchanged. Parks budget line has a slight increase from the forecasted spend. Lands remains unchanged, and hunting and angling actually got a budget cut of about $4 million. There is a significant capital investment in parks right now for this fiscal year, jumping from the forecast spend of $59.6 million to $83 million. Lands actually gets a slight increase from the budget, but a decrease from the forecasted spend. And then the forest budget line stays unchanged. Hunting and angling also has a capital investment of about $17 million from the forecasted spend. And then in terms of environment and protected areas, they want to strengthen environmental stewardship and conservation. There's $27 million allocated for caribou recovery planning. $10 million allocated through the Land Stewardship Fund. $17.9 million to mitigate the impact of adverse environmental events or emergencies. $5.8 million to address aquatic invasive species management. Their focus, one of their key outcomes is sustainable economic development within environmental capacity. So this is looking at the All Resorts Act and things like that, and how that all plays into it. In terms of budget lines, the most substantial change is in the Fish and Wildlife budget line, where it gets a cut of almost $20 million. Everything else remains relatively unchanged outside of emissions management, which sees a $24 million cut. So relatively unchanged. Specific support indicated for search and rescue program development. I think I remember reading about search and rescue. Could at least just take a look here. Search and rescue is included in outcome 3 of the Public Safety and Emergency Services Business Plan. It says the ministry will also continue the improvement of the delivery model and funding operations in the province. But when I look at the initiatives to support that, it says $2.9 million is allocated to improve the delivery model search and rescue operations. So that should answer that question. Anybody else? I'm cognizant of time and I don't want to take up more of your time than you need. If you have questions that I didn't get to or that you weren't able to ask here, feel free to shoot me an email. It occurs to me that I don't have my email on this slide, so apologies. It's just, I don't even think I could type it in here. Just a.burke@albertacounsel.com. But feel free to shoot me a message. Happy to address anything I might have missed. And heavens knows I probably missed a lot because there's lots to go through. The community and voluntary support services, what is that drop going to affect? I think that is a little harder to answer off the hop because I think that is a grouped, there's a bunch of programs put into that and I don't know what specifically they're targeting. So I think this will be part of the program review and we'll see what that looks like when they're done that review. Anybody else? If not, I will say thank you very much for your time. I appreciate you taking your lunch to spend it here to go through the budget. I look forward to chatting with some of you later on, and we will make sure that we send out the slides and the recording shortly, if not today, probably tomorrow. So thanks again, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.